Abigail. Wren stood in the middle of the auction yard with dust on her shoes, sweat running down the back of her neck, and every cruel eye in Caldwell Flats turned toward her as if she had stepped onto a stage built special for her humiliation. The blind mare stood trembling at the end of the lead rope. She was so thin the sunlight caught the bones beneath her hide. Her gray coat hung dull and patchy over her ribs, and her white eyes stared at nothing pale as creek ice in January. Flies gathered at the corners of those eyes, and the mare did not even toss her head to drive them off. She only stood there old and tired and silent, while the men around her laughed like suffering was a thing made for entertainment. Abby's hand was still raised. It shook, but she did not lower it. $1, she said. The words came out smaller than she meant them to, but the whole yard heard. For half a breath there was quiet. Then the laughter broke loose. It rolled through the barn lot sharp and easy, bouncing off the fence rails and the feed wagons and the sun-baked side of the auction barn. Men slapped their thighs. A pair of young cowboys near the water trough bent forward like they had been punched in the stomach by the joke of it. Even the auctioneer, red-faced Dobbins, looked at her with his mouth hanging open, as if he had never in all his years seen foolishness take human form quite so plainly. "Well, I'll be," someone called. "Fat girl found herself a horse that moves slower than she does." More laughter. Abby felt the words strike where they always struck first, not her ears, but somewhere under the breastbone in that old bruised place where she had kept every name they had ever given her. Heavy girl, slow girl, plain girl, too much girl, not enough girl, the kind of girl men looked past unless they wanted something to laugh at. She wanted to drop her hand. She wanted to turn and walk out through the gate, past the tethered horses and wagons, past the women pretending not to smile, past the boys who had grown tall but not kind. She wanted to go home to the little Wren place with its sagging porch and dry well and empty rooms where her mother's voice no longer moved, but the mark on the mare's shoulder held her still. It was half hidden beneath dust and dried mud burned into the old gray hide, a circle split clean through by one straight line. Abby knew that mark. She had seen it in the bottom of her mother's cedar trunk scratched into the back of an old brush handle. She had seen it drawn in pencil on a folded letter her mother cried over once and burned the next morning. She had seen it in dreams she did not admit to having, dreams where her father stood at the edge of timber with his hat in his hand trying to tell her something wind would not let her hear. Samuel Wren's brand, her father's brand. The man who had ridden into the Bitterroot Mountains when Abby was 7 years old and never come home. Dobbins cleared his throat, still smiling. "Miss Wren, you understand this animal ain't fit for much of anything. Blind as a cellar at midnight. Poor condition. Likely won't last the month." $1, Abby said again. Her voice steadied this time. Not loud, not brave exactly, but set down firm like a fence post driven into hard ground. Harlow Briggs, a broad-shouldered cattle buyer with a belly full of tobacco and opinions, turned toward her. "Abby girl, you barely got enough feed for yourself. What in God's name you want with a bag of bones?" Abby looked at him. She had spent most of her life looking away from men like Harlow because looking at them only gave them invitation. Today she did not look away. "I didn't ask you to feed her," she said. The laughter changed then. It did not stop, but it thinned at the edges. A few men glanced at one another. People did not like it when the object of a joke answered back. It made the joke less clean. Dobbins lifted both hands as if washing himself of the matter. "Sold then. $1 to Abigail Wren. May the Lord have mercy on them both." The crowd laughed again, but Abby was already walking. Every step felt longer than it should have. Her dress clung damply to her sides. She knew how she looked to them, round-faced, broad-hipped, breath tight from the heat. A poor girl in patched sleeves walking toward a dying horse as if she had won something. She could feel their eyes measuring her body, weighing her against the mare, finding both of them wanting. The hired hand held out the rope with a look that was almost pity. Abby took it. The mare turned her head toward her at once, not seeing, no, but sensing. Her nostrils flared, her ears tilted forward. Slowly, carefully, she reached her nose toward Abby's wrist. Abby stood still. Her father's voice came back to her so clearly it nearly hurt. "Don't grab for the face, little bird. Let a horse learn you first. Fear makes a hard hand, and a hard hand ruins trust." The mare's soft nose touched Abby's sleeve, then her palm, then the side of her dress where dust had gathered. The animal breathed her in, patient and searching. Abby swallowed against the ache rising in her throat. Everyone else had looked at her and seen too much flesh, too much awkwardness, too much shame. This blind creature could see none of that. The mare only knew whether Abby was cruel. Abby lifted her free hand and placed it gently against the mare's neck below the jaw, where the skin was warm and loose. "All right," she whispered. "I've got you now." The mare exhaled long and low, as if some private decision had been made. Abby paid Dobbins with one of the 4 coins tied in her handkerchief. The dollar left her palm with a finality that frightened her. $3 remained. Feed money, flour money, nail money for the loose plank on the porch she had been meaning to fix since spring. $1 was not a small thing when a person had only 4. But the mark on Ash's shoulder she had already begun calling the mare. Ash, somewhere deep inside herself, was not small either. It was impossible. And impossible things, Abby knew, either broke a person or pulled her out of the life she had been hiding in. She led the mare toward the far fence where her old gelding waited. The crowd had already turned back to the auction, eager for better animals and cleaner jokes, but a few people still watched her. One of the young cowboys cupped his hands around his mouth. "Careful, Abby. That horse might mistake you for a haystack." The words struck, but not as deep as before. Ash stopped walking. Her ears turned toward the boy's voice. Then, with slow and almost solemn dignity, the blind mare lowered her head and leaned lightly against Abby's shoulder. Abby did not know why that small weight nearly undid her. She looked down at the rope in her hand, at the dust around her boots, at the old brand beneath the dirt on the mare's shoulder. Her father had vanished into silence. Her mother had died with questions folded inside her like letters never sent. Caldwell Flats had laughed until memory itself seemed ashamed to speak. But this horse had come back, broken, starved, blind, and unwanted, but carrying Samuel Wren's mark as plainly as a word from the grave. Abby tied Ash beside the gelding and waited until the auction yard noise swelled behind her again. Then she leaned close to the mare's shoulder, where dust lay thick over the burned circle and line. "Where did you come from?" she whispered. Ash flicked one ear toward her voice. The summer sun dropped lower over Caldwell Flats, throwing long shadows from the barn posts across the yellow dirt. Abby felt suddenly that one of those shadows had stretched all the way from the Bitterroot Mountains and touched the ground beneath her feet. She had come to the auction looking for a cheap pack animal. She was leaving with a blind horse, her father's brand, and a question old enough to have teeth. By the time she turned the animals toward home, the laughter had faded behind her. But the mark remained waiting under dust and dried mud, and Abby knew before she reached her cabin that she would not sleep until she had cleaned it clear enough to tell whether the dead had truly found a way to speak. By the time Abigail Wren reached home, the sun had dropped behind the Bitterroot Mountains and left the sky the color of cooling iron. Her cabin stood alone on the worn edge of her father's old land, where the grass grew thin and yellow, and the fence leaned in places like tired men. The porch sagged on one side. The well rope had frayed near the handle. A loose shutter tapped against the wall whenever the evening wind came down from the hills. It was not much of a place to come back to, but it was hers, and after the auction yard, even its loneliness felt kinder than town. Ash moved slowly beside the old gelding, each step placed with careful thought. The blind mare had not stumbled once on the road home. Abby had expected to drag her expected trouble at the creek crossing, expected the animal to panic at every sound and shadow. Instead, Ash had walked as if she had made some private agreement with the earth. Her ears worked constantly, turning toward wheels birds brush Abby's breath, the creak of the gelding's saddle. She didn't see the road, but she listened to it. Abby tied both horses beneath the lean-to and carried out a small measure of feed she could hardly spare. The gelding ate first with the dull confidence of an animal used to receiving what little there was. Ash lowered her head slowly to the bucket, sniffed, then began to eat with small, careful bites. "You're not dead yet," Abby said softly. Ash's ears turned toward her voice. "No," Abby whispered. "Neither am I." The words surprised her after she said them. They seemed too large for the yard, too honest for the evening. She looked toward the empty cabin windows and half expected her mother to answer from inside, but the house remained still. Her mother had been gone 11 months, and silence had settled into the room so completely that Abby sometimes thought it had become another piece of furniture. She lit the lantern after dark. The flame came up small and yellow, trembling inside the glass chimney. Abby carried it back to the lean-to with a wet cloth, a pail of water, and her heart beating harder than any reasonable thing required. She told herself she was being foolish. Brands could resemble other brands. Dust and grief could shape a mark into whatever the heart wanted badly enough to see. A lonely girl could make a ghost out of mud if she stared long enough. But when she held the lantern close to Ash's shoulder, the old burned mark waited exactly where she had seen it. A circle, a straight line through the center. Abby dipped the cloth into the water and began to clean. She worked slowly because the skin around the brand looked tender beneath years of neglect. Dirt loosened in brown streaks, old mud broke away. The gray coat darkened under the wet cloth, then shone faintly in the lantern light. Abby wiped once, twice, 3 times until the whole mark stood clear. Her knees weakened. A mark burned deep enough can outlive the man who made it the horse that carried it, and every lie meant to bury it. She did not know whether she spoke the thought aloud or only heard it inside herself in a voice that was partly hers and partly her father's. Either way, the truth of it settled over her. This was Samuel Wren's brand. Not almost, not maybe, not a grieving daughter's mistake. It was his. Abby pressed her palm against the mare's shoulder close, but not on the old scar. The heat of Ash's body moved through her hand. The horse stood quietly, her blind eyes turned toward the dark yard. "Where have you been?" Abby whispered. "Who had you?" Ash breathed out slow and heavy. Abby closed her eyes and remembered her father's hands. They had been broad hands, nicked and scarred, always smelling of leather horse sweat, pine pitch, and smoke. When Abby was small, before her body became something other people noticed and named, Samuel used to lift her onto the fence rail and draw his brand in the dirt with a stick. "That there is a promise, little bird," he would say. "Not just a claim. A man's mark ought to mean he stands behind what carries it. Even a horse," she had asked. "Especially a horse. Why? So no matter how far it travels, the truth of where it belongs can be traced home." Abby opened her eyes. The yard was darker now. The mountains were black against a sky full of hard white stars. Somewhere beyond them lay the country that had swallowed Samuel Wren and returned only rumor. The town had said he got lost. Some said Indians. Some said weather. Some said a man who went into mountains alone had no one to blame but himself. Her mother had never accepted any of it. But grief had slowly turned her questions inward until they became illness, then silence, then a grave beside the churchyard. Abby took the lantern and went inside. The cabin smelled of old wood-cold ashes and the faint cedar scent that still came from her mother's trunk beneath the bed. Abby stood in the doorway for a moment, afraid to move. It was strange how a person could ride home with a ghost in her hands and still be frightened by a box under a bed. At last she knelt and dragged the trunk out. The iron hinges protested, dust lifted from the lid. Abby had not opened it since the week after her mother's burial, when she had looked at the folded dresses and old papers and shut it again because memory felt like something with teeth. Tonight she opened it. On top lay her mother's church gloves, stiff and yellowed at the fingertips. Beneath them were folded aprons, a quilt square never finished, 2 letters tied with string, and the brittle newspaper clipping that told how Samuel Wren, local horse breeder, had gone missing in the Bitterroot Range in the spring of 1843. Abby had read it so often the words had become less information than wound. She set it aside and kept digging. Near the bottom, beneath a shawl that still held a faint trace of lavender soap, her fingers touched oilcloth. Abby stopped breathing. She drew it out carefully. It was folded into a tight square, the edges cracked with age but still strong. When she opened it on the table, the lantern flame bent in the draft and threw long shadows across the lines. It was a map, not printed, drawn by hand. Mountain ridges, creek bends, old trail marks, elevation notes written in small, precise letters that leaned slightly forward as if walking into wind. Her father's handwriting. Abby gripped the table until her knuckles hurt. The map showed a route into the Bitterroots past Harmon Ridge, up through narrow timber, and toward a place marked beside a split line of water. Split Rock Creek. She turned the oilcloth over. On the back, in pencil faded nearly gray with age, were 11 words written harder and faster than the rest. "If I do not come home, start at Split Rock Creek." Abby sat down because her legs would no longer hold her. The cabin seemed to draw away from her. The lamp, the table, the cold stove, the empty chair where her mother used to mend socks. Everything remained exactly as it was, yet nothing felt the same. Her father had not simply vanished. He had expected danger. He had left instructions. Her mother had hidden them. And now a blind mare with his brand had come through a laughing auction yard and placed the first living piece of the trail back into Abby's hands. She looked toward the dark window, though she could see only her own reflection in the glass. Round face, wide shoulders, frightened eyes, a girl people had always found easy to dismiss. Behind that reflection, the mountains waited. Split Rock Creek lay in Crowder country. Silas Crowder owned more cattle than some towns had people. He owned water rights grazing roads, judges' favors, and Sheriff Briggs's spine. Men lowered their voices when they said his name, and women changed subjects when his riders passed. Abby remembered one thing clearly from childhood, though she had never understood its weight until now. Her father had argued with Crowder outside the feed store 3 days before he rode north. Her mother had watched from the wagon, one hand pressed to her mouth. Abby folded the map once, then stopped. Her hands were shaking too badly to finish. She wanted morning to be simple. She wanted to wake and find the brand less clear, the map unreadable, the message only grief-making shapes. But outside, ash shifted under the lean-to, and the sound was real. The mark was real. The handwriting was real. Abby placed the oilcloth beside the lantern and looked at the last $3 on the table. Feed money, flour money, survival money. Then she looked at the map again. If ash had come from somewhere, someone had sold her. Someone had brought Samuel Wren's branded horse into Caldwell Flats and let her go for $1, either careless or frightened enough to make a mistake. Abby would begin there. At first light, she would go back to town. She would ask the auction clerk who had brought in the blind mare. She would ask until someone answered, and if the answer led toward Crowder, then the laughter in Caldwell Flats had been the least dangerous thing waiting for her. The auction clerk's office smelled of ink dust and old paper, which was to say it smelled like men trying to make the truth behave. Abby Wren stood just inside the doorway, with Samuel's map folded tight in the pocket of her dress, and the memory of Ash's brand burning so hard in her mind that she could almost feel it under her own skin. Morning light came thin through the office window, striking the ledger books stacked along the wall and turning the dust in the air to gold. Outside, Caldwell Flats was still waking. Wagons creaked. A rooster complained somewhere behind the livery. Men called to one another in voices not yet sharpened by heat. The young clerk behind the desk looked up and went still. Petrie Vale was narrow-shouldered, pale, and always seemed to have ink on his fingers, no matter how careful he was. He stared at Abby the way most people stared at her, first at her face, then lower, then quickly away, as if politeness had arrived too late to stop the first look. "Miss Wren," he said, "did you need something?" Abby took one step forward. Her boots sounded louder than they should have on the floorboards. "The gray mare I bought yesterday," she said. "The blind one. I need to know who brought her in." Petrie blinked. "Auction records ain't generally I paid for her. Yes, but that makes her mine," Abby said. "And I want to know where my horse came from." Petrie's eyes flicked toward the window, then back to her. It was a small movement, but Abby saw it. Fear made men look toward doors and windows before it made them answer. "You planning to return her?" he asked. "No. Then I don't see why it matters. It matters to me." He swallowed, then pulled a heavy ledger toward him. The book landed on the desk with a tired thump. Abby watched him turn pages. His fingers moved down columns of names and numbers over tidy lines that decided the worth of living creatures. $30, 42, 17, 5, 1. He stopped. "The mare came in with a lot from Crowder Ranch," he said quietly. "Old stock, 6 animals total, brought in by Tate Harmon." Abby didn't move. The office seemed to shrink around her. Crowder Ranch, Tate Harmon. The names landed exactly where she had feared they would. If Silas Crowder wanted the blind mare back, then the $1 horse was worth more than any man at that auction understood. The thought came with such force that Abby had to press her hand against the desk to steady herself. Petrie looked at her hand, then at her face. "You know something I'm asking if you do." He shut the ledger halfway, then stopped as if even closing the book might be a kind of decision. "Tate came back yesterday evening," for what Petrie rubbed his thumb over the ink stain on his forefinger. "The mare." Abby's throat tightened. "He asked for her, said there had been a mistake, said that particular mare wasn't supposed to be sold. Did he describe her gray?" "Blind." Petrie's voice lowered. "Branded." The room went quiet except for the faint scratching of a mouse somewhere in the wall. Abby leaned in slightly. What did he say about the brand, only that it was registered and needed accounting for? To Crowder, Petrie hesitated too long. Petrie. He looked suddenly younger than he had a moment before. "Miss Wren, some questions are heavier than folks think before they pick them up. I know what heavy feels like." Color rose in his cheeks, not from insult, but shame. "I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant." She straightened. Did Tate say who the brand belonged to? No, but he knew it mattered. That much was plain. Abby stepped back from the desk. Her heart was beating with a steady, hard rhythm now. Not panic, Something colder. Crowder's men knew the brand. They had brought Ash to the auction, let her sell for $1, then realized too late what they had done. That meant the mare had been on Crowder land long enough for someone there to notice Samuel Wren's mark. It also meant they had hoped no one else would. Petrie closed the ledger carefully. "Miss Wren, that horse ain't worth whatever trouble you're thinking of finding." Abby looked at him. Then why did Tate come back for her? He had no answer. She left him sitting behind his desk with the ledger closed under both hands as if he were holding down a lid on something that might climb out. Main Street was brighter now. Heat had already begun to rise from the dirt. Abby kept her head straight and her pace, even though she felt every glance as she crossed toward the feed store. Two of Crowder's riders stood by the hitching rail outside the saloon, both in dusty brown canvas, both pretending not to watch her. They failed. One was young with a thin mouth and a hat pulled low. The other was older, thick through the shoulders, his face carved flat by sun and weather. When Abby passed the older one, spat into the street. "Morning, Miss Wren," he said. She did not answer, horse settling in. Her hand closed around the folded map in her pocket. She kept walking. Behind her, the young rider laughed softly, not like the auction crowd. This laughter had less pleasure in it and more warning. At the general store, Mrs. Bell watched Abby buy a small sack of oats and a length of spare rope. Her eyes lingered on Abby's face with sharp curiosity. "Heard you bought that blind mare," Mrs. Bell said. "You heard right. Folks say you paid too much. Folks have always been generous with opinions." Mrs. Bell's mouth twitched almost a smile. "They say Crowder's men came asking after her." Abby looked up. The older woman lowered her voice. "You be careful, Abigail. Some men don't mind being cruel in public, but the dangerous ones are worse when they get quiet." Abby carried the oats home with that sentence walking beside her like a shadow. Ash was standing under the lean-to when Abby returned, her white eyes turned toward the sound of the gate. The mare lifted her head and gave a low breath. Abby set down the feed and stood for a moment with one hand on the fence. "You came from Crowder," she said. Ash flicked one ear. "You carried my father's mark all this way, and now they want you back." The mare's nostrils moved, reading the air. Abby reached over the rail and touched her neck. She had been afraid on the walk home, afraid of Crowder, of Tate, of the mountain, of what the map might lead her to find. But looking at Ash, thin and blind and still waiting, Abby felt the shape of her fear change. It did not leave her. It settled into purpose. She saddled the old gelding first, then stopped. Ash turned toward the creak of leather. Abby looked at the blind mare's narrow back, the bony hips, the calm ears. Riding her into the Bitterroots would be foolish, maybe dangerous, maybe exactly what everyone would expect from the fat girl who bought a dying horse because she mistook pity for sense. But Samuel's brand was not on the gelding. It was on Ash. If the trail belonged to anyone now, it belonged to the two of them. Abby carried out the old saddle and set it gently across Ash's back. The mare shifted but did not shy. Abby tightened the cinch slowly, speaking in a low voice the way her father had taught her. Her hands remembered what the rest of her had nearly forgotten. A bootstep sounded behind her. Abby turned fast. A man stood near the edge of the yard, tall and lean, with a rifle balanced across one arm and no expression easy enough to name. He was maybe 38. Sundark, with eyes that looked as if they had spent years watching trouble approach from a long distance. "You're Abigail Wren," he said. "And you're standing on my land." One corner of his mouth moved. "Caleb Rusk. I run a small spread past Harmon Ridge. That don't explain your boots in my yard." "No," he said. "It doesn't." Abby waited. His eyes moved to Ash, then to the brand on her shoulder. Something in his face tightened. "You know whose mark that is," Abby said. "I know the name Samuel Wren." The sound of her father's name in a stranger's mouth made the morning feel thinner. "My father's ranch sat 4 miles from Crowder Water before Crowder decided it shouldn't." Caleb's voice stayed even. "Old men used to go quiet when Samuel Wren came up, quiet in the way that means everybody knows something and nobody wants to die saying it." Abby's fingers curled in Ash's mane. "I'm going to Split Rock Creek. I figured you might. I didn't ask for company. I'm not offering company. I'm offering distance. I'll follow behind, far enough not to trouble you, close enough if Crowder's riders decide a girl and a blind horse are easy arithmetic." Abby studied him. She had known men who helped because they wanted gratitude. Caleb Rusk did not look hungry for gratitude. He looked like a man carrying an old unpaid debt. "You lost something to Crowder," she said. He was quiet. That was answer enough. Abby put one foot in the stirrup and pulled herself into the saddle. Ash stood steady beneath her. For a moment, Abby felt every cruel voice from town rise up inside her, telling her she was too heavy, too foolish, too afraid. Then Ash took one step forward, and another. Abby looked toward the blue shape of the bitter roots. "Stay out of my way," she said. Caleb nodded once. "Try to keep up," she added. This time he almost smiled. Abby touched her heels to Ash's sides, and the blind mare moved toward the mountain with Samuel Wren's brand on her shoulder and Samuel Wren's map in Abby's pocket, while Caldwell Flats shrank behind them into dust, silence, and watching eyes. The first shot of pain came before the mountain trail, even steep and sharp in Abby Wren's lower back, and deep in her thighs, the old familiar ache that always seemed to whisper the same thing every cruel mouth in Caldwell Flats had said aloud. Too heavy, too slow, too soft for hard country. She tightened her grip on the reins and said nothing. Ash climbed beneath her with the careful patience of an animal listening to the earth. The blind mare's ears moved constantly, catching the scrape of loose stone, the sigh of dry grass, the creak of saddle leather, the distant clink of Caleb Rusk's bridle somewhere behind them. She did not rush. She did not panic. Each hoof found its place as if the trail spoke in a language only she understood. The bitter roots rose ahead, blue and severe under the morning sun. Their slopes were patched with pine shadow and open rock, and the higher Abby climbed, the smaller Caldwell Flats became behind her. That should have comforted her. Instead, every mile away from town felt like another mile closer to whatever had taken her father. The mountain didn't care whether Abby Wren was fat, frightened, or brave. It only cared whether she could keep climbing. The thought settled in her with the cold honesty of creek water. It didn't matter what folks had called her. It didn't matter whether Harlow Briggs laughed or Mrs. Bell warned her or Petrie Vale looked at her with fear in his ink-stained eyes. The mountain had no use for pity. It would not make the trail wider because she was scared. It would not soften a stone because her knees hurt. It would not tell her she was doing fine just because nobody else ever had. It would only ask whether she could go on. Ash's head dipped. Abby felt the mare test the grade beneath her hooves, and she shifted her weight slightly left, guiding her away from a washout where rain had eaten the edge of the trail. Ash followed the pressure without resistance. The trust of it startled Abby every time. This horse could not see the drop. She could not see the rocks or the narrow strip of dirt or the black pines leaning over the path like old men with secrets. Yet she went where Abby asked. "You're a fool," Abby whispered, though her voice softened around the words. "Trusting me like that." Ash flicked one ear back. Abby almost smiled. "I know, I bought you. That don't prove sense." Behind her, a horse snorted somewhere down the trail. Caleb was still there, far enough not to crowd her, close enough that his presence pressed against the morning like a quiet answer. He had kept his word. He had not tried to take charge, had not called advice after her, had not treated her like something likely to fall apart. That unsettled her more than if he had. Men usually told Abby what they thought she could not do before she had a chance to try. Caleb Rusk seemed content to let the mountain find out first. By mid-morning, the heat thickened. Sweat gathered beneath Abby's collar and along the band of her hat. Her palms grew slick around the reins. The saddle creaked under her, and once, when Ash stepped over a fallen branch, Abby's breath caught with the effort of staying balanced. Shame rose hot in her face, though no one had spoken. She heard one of the auction boys in memory laughing by the trough. "That horse might mistake you for a haystack." Her jaw tightened. Ash stopped, not stumbled, not tired. Stopped. Abby froze with her. The mare's whole body changed beneath the saddle. Her head lifted. Her nostrils widened. Her ears stood forward, then turned slightly, catching something above them on the trail. Abby held her breath. At first, she heard only wind moving through dry pine needles and the far-off cry of a hawk. Then came the sound Ash had caught before her voices. Low male voices, 2 of them, maybe 3 around the bend ahead. Abby's heartbeat slammed once hard. She laid her palm against Ash's neck. The mare was warm but steady. No trembling, no fear. Only attention. Slowly, Abby drew the mare backward. Ash obeyed with astonishing care, placing each hoof where Abby asked until they slipped into the shade of a stand of lodgepole pines beside the trail. The branches scratched Abby's sleeve. Dust rose around them. She leaned low over Ash's neck and pressed her fingers into the coarse gray mane. "Easy," she breathed. The voices grew clearer. 2 riders came around the bend at a walk, dressed in Crowder brown canvas rifles, resting in saddle boots. Their horses were fresh, too fresh for men wandering by chasses. One rider was young with a narrow face and restless eyes. The other was thick-necked and older, chewing something that made his jaw move side to side like a mill wheel. "Still say Tate should have checked before bringing that lot in," the young one said. "Tate, don't make mistakes. He made one yesterday." The older man spat over the side of his horse. "Crowder says find the mare, we find the mare." Abby's fingers tightened in Ash's mane. The young man laughed once without humor. All this trouble over a dead man's brand. The words entered Abby quietly. Not like a shout, not like a blow. Worse. They entered like a key turning in a lock she had been afraid to open. A dead man's brand. Her father was not missing to them, not lost, not swallowed by weather or mountain or time. Crowder's men spoke of him as dead with the casual certainty of men repeating something known. The riders passed within 30 feet of the pines. Ash did not move. Abby barely dared breathe. A fly crawled along the mare's neck, and still the horse stood silent, as if she understood that sound could kill them. When the riders disappeared down the lower trail, Abby waited. She counted slowly to 100, then to 100 again. Only when the last hoofbeat faded into the mountain did she guide Ash back onto the path. Caleb emerged from cover behind her, leading his horse by the reins. His face told her he had heard every word. "You all right?" he asked. "No." It was the truth, and it cost her less than lying would have. He nodded. "No, I expect not." She looked up the trail. Her eyes burned, but no tears fell. She had spent years imagining her father alive, somewhere beyond reach. Then years pretending she no longer imagined it. Now, 2 Crowder men had tossed the truth into the air like tobacco spit. Dead. The word should have broken something. Instead, it hardened her. "They know," she said. Caleb's voice lowered. "Yes, they always knew." He didn't answer. Abby touched her heels to Ash. "Then we keep climbing." The trail narrowed after that. The grade grew meaner. Twice Abby had to dismount and lead Ash over exposed stone where the mare's hooves searched carefully for purchase. Walking was worse than riding. Her lungs burned. Her dress caught on brush. Sweat slid into her eyes. Her body felt large and clumsy against the steepness of the mountain, and each step asked whether she had any business being there. But she kept going. Ash followed the sound of her voice. "Step," Abby murmured. "Good girl. Easy now." Left. "There you are." The mare trusted her through rock and shadow, and somewhere in that steady exchange, Abby began to understand that trust was not a soft thing. It was work. It was listening. It was placing your life in another creature's hands and moving anyway. Near noon, Ash stopped again. This time there was no alarm in her. She lowered her head toward the brush along the trail nostrils working. Abby followed her attention and saw only dead grass, a fallen fence post, and a tangle of old wire nearly swallowed by weeds. Caleb came up behind her but said nothing. Abby dismounted slowly. Her legs trembled when her boots hit the ground. She pushed through the brittle grass and crouched beside the collapsed post. The wood was gray with age, split along one side, half buried in soil and pine needles. Rusted horseshoes lay tangled nearby, the iron so old it had gone orange and thin. Something about the place pulled at her memory, not a memory exactly, a shape of one. Her father kneeling beside tack and lamplight, her mother complaining he marked everything as if the Lord himself might misplace it. Samuel laughing and saying a man ought to sign what he made, even if only the horse appreciated it. Abby rolled the fallen post carefully. Beneath it, protected from weather by the angle of the wood, was a strip of old leather. Her breath caught. She lifted it with both hands. It was brittle, but not broken part of a bridle strap by the look of it. On the underside, scratched deep by a knife point, were 2 letters, S.R. For a moment, the mountain went silent around her. Abby sat back on her heels, the leather held against her chest. The ache in her legs, the heat, the insults, the fear of Crowder's men, all of it fell away beneath one simple certainty. Her father had been here. Not in rumor, not in memory. Here on this trail with his hands on this leather, leaving a mark, because that was what Samuel Wren did. He left marks so things could be traced. Caleb crouched a few feet away. His Abby nodded. Her throat felt too tight for more. Caleb looked toward the higher trail, then into the trees. "There's an old camp sign half a mile back. Recent tracks around it. Someone's been watching this route." Abby closed her hand around the leather. "Then they're watching for what he hid. Likely." She stood. Her body complained, but she ignored it. Ash waited in the trail, blind eyes, calm, ears tilted toward Abby as if listening for grief and instruction both. Abby tucked the leather into her pocket beside the oilcloth map. The two touched there, old proof against old silence. Far ahead, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of moving water. Not loud, not rushing. a low, steady conversation over stone. Abby looked toward it, and the map in her pocket seemed to grow heavier. "Split Rock Creek," she said. Caleb followed her gaze. Ash lifted her head toward the water and took one step forward before Abby even touched the reins, as if the blind mare had been listening for that sound longer than either of them knew. The sound of Split Rock Creek came through the pines before the water showed itself low and steady like somebody speaking in another room. Abby Wren stood at the edge of the old trail with one hand tangled in Ash's mane and the other pressed against the folded map in her pocket. Her legs ached from the climb. Her lungs still had the thin, hard burn of mountain air in them. Sweat had dried along her collar and left salt at her skin. But all that seemed far away now, small and bodily compared with the sound ahead, water over stone. Her father had heard that same sound. Ash lifted her blind head toward it, nostrils wide, ears forward. The old mare took another step without being asked, careful and certain, as if the creek had called her by a name she remembered from someplace deeper than sight. "Easy," Abby whispered, but she did not pull her back. They passed between two granite shoulders where the trees thinned and the ground dipped. Then the creek appeared narrow and clear, cutting through the mountain with quiet persistence. Upstream, a pale rock formation split the water cleanly in two, sending one stream left and one stream right before they joined again below. Abby drew out the map. Her father's hand had drawn that shape exactly. The split stone, the bend, the stand of pines beyond the bank, even the small rise where the trail widened into what had once been a camp. "He was here," she said. The words barely rose above the creek, but Caleb heard them. He had come up behind her leading his horse, his face solemn under the shadow of his hat. "Yes," he said. "Not maybe, not could be, yes." The old camp lay under years of fallen needles and leaves. A fire ring sat half buried near the creek, its stones blackened by a past so old the soot had become part of them. Beside it, a rusted iron stake stood crooked in the earth, a chain ring hanging from it. Men had tied horses there once. Maybe Samuel had tied his own horse there. Maybe Ash had stood near that stake when she was young and sighted carrying her silver coat, and Samuel's mark into mountain light. Abby's throat tightened. She stepped into the camp as if stepping into a room where the dead still slept. The largest pine stood back from the water, its trunk wide and furrowed roots pushing through the ground like knuckles. Beneath it, the earth looked wrong, not freshly disturbed, but different from the surrounding soil, raised in one place and sunken in another, as if time had tried to smooth a secret and failed. Abby knelt. Her hands shook once before she pressed them into the pine needles. Her father had not left her a grave first. He had left her the truth locked in iron and waiting under pine needles. She did not know why that thought came so clearly, but it settled over her with the same force as the brand had done. Samuel Wren had known he might not come home. He had known danger was close enough to breathe on him. Yet whatever he feared, he had hidden something here for her to find, or for someone brave enough to keep looking. She dug with her hands first. Caleb crouched beside her and worked silently, pushing aside debris, loosening soil with his knife when the ground grew stubborn. Neither of them spoke. The creek filled the silence. Ash stood a few yards away, reins looped loosely over a branch, her white eyes turned toward Abby's breathing. The first touch of metal came cold against Abby's fingers. She froze. Caleb stopped moving. Together, they cleared away the last layer of earth and pine needles. An iron box emerged from the ground, dark with age but whole. Its corners rusted, its lid sealed tight under a corroded lock. It was not large, but it looked heavy in the way serious things are heavy before they are lifted. Abby sat back on her heels. For 40 years, men had ridden near this creek. Storms had washed the stones. Snow had covered the ground. Elk had passed. Pines had dropped needles season after season, hiding the box more kindly than any person in Caldwell Flats had hidden Samuel's name. And now it lay in front of her. Caleb took a small iron tool from his saddlebag. "May I?" Abby nodded because she did not trust her voice. The old lock resisted, then gave with a dry snap that sounded too loud. Abby flinched. Caleb looked toward the timber. Nothing moved except creek water and pine shadow. The lid opened with a groan. Inside, the contents were wrapped in oilcloth like the map. Abby reached in and lifted the first bundle. Her fingers knew before her mind did that these papers mattered. She unfolded them carefully. Land deeds, county survey documents, water rights, names crossed out, altered, written over. She stared at one page, then another. The original ink lay faded beneath darker corrections. Silas Crowder's name appeared where other men's names had been. Puit, Tansey, Cork, Hale, Wren. Abby's mouth went dry. "He stole it," she said. "He stole all of it." Caleb leaned closer and the color went hard in his face. These are forgeries. The second bundle held ledger pages, columns of dates, sums, names, payments. Abby read slowly, her stomach tightening with each line. Money paid to men for witness statements. Money paid to writers. Money paid beside descriptions that sounded gentle only because evil often used tidy words to dress itself. Removal, pressure, correction, settlement. Caleb pointed once, his finger not touching the page. That's my father's name. Abby looked. Rusk allotment. Reassigned. She turned toward him, but Caleb's eyes stayed on the ledger. His jaw had gone tight enough to hurt. He never knew, Caleb said quietly. Or maybe he knew and couldn't prove it. Abby folded the page with care as if anger might tear it. The last bundle was smaller, a letter. She knew the handwriting before she saw the signature. June 3rd, 1843, Split Rock Creek, Bitterroot Range. Abby read. Samuel Wren wrote that he had gathered enough evidence to bring charges against Silas Crowder for land fraud, water theft, forged records, and forced removals. Crowder knew he had been gathering information. Tate Harmon had come to his camp with money and warning. Samuel had refused both. He expected worse before morning. Then came the lines that broke through Abby's ribs and found the child still waiting there. If this box reaches my daughter Abigail, tell her I did not run. Tell her I knew what I was doing, and I did it willingly because someone had to. Tell her the Wren name means something, and I intend to make sure it still means something after I'm gone. I love her more than I ever knew how to say. That is a father's failing, and I own it. Samuel Wren. Abby read the last line twice. The paper blurred. She blinked hard, but tears fell anyway, landing dark on the sleeve of her dress. She held the letter to her chest, bending over it as if her body could shelter what 40 years of earth had already protected. He didn't leave us, she whispered. Caleb said nothing. Good man, she thought dimly. He understood silence. For years, Abby had carried the shame of being left behind. A heavy girl in a failing house, a daughter of a missing man, a person the town believed was easy to laugh at because no one powerful stood behind her. But Samuel had stood behind her. Even in death, he had left his mark, his map, his proof, his love, awkward and plain and stronger than the grave. Ash gave a low sound behind her. Abby lifted her head. The mare's ears were turned upslope. Caleb heard it too. His hand moved toward his rifle. A crack split the afternoon. Rock burst from the granite beside the creek chips, spraying across the ground. Ash shied hard, pulling against the reins, but Abby was already moving. She folded the letter, shoved it back into the oilcloth, and placed every bundle into the iron box with fast, careful hands. Another shot rang above them. Go, Caleb said. I know. Abby hauled the box up. It was heavier than she expected, but she carried it to Ash and tied it against the saddle with shaking fingers that somehow remembered every knot her father had ever taught her. Voices sounded high on the ridge, men moving, Crowder's men. Ash trembled beneath Abby's hand, but she didn't bolt. Abby pressed her forehead briefly against the mare's neck. Trust me, she whispered, just a little farther. Then she pulled herself into the saddle, the strong box hard against her leg. Her father's letter burning inside it like a coal that no darkness had managed to kill. Caleb fired once toward the ridge. Abby turned Ash east away from the main trail toward the narrow descent her father's map had marked in thin, careful lines. The blind mare stepped forward into danger, and Abby Wren went with her, carrying 40 years of buried truth down the mountain while bullets cracked behind them.